You ever feel like you want to instantly level up your understanding of something important, like without spending hours buried in articles?
Yeah, that feeling of needing to be informed, but just not having the time.
Exactly. You want to be well informed, but the thought of sifting through endless research papers feels, well, daunting, right?
Definitely.
That's exactly what we do here. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a learning tool that's popping up more and more in education: self-assessment.
Precisely. And when we say self-assessment, we're not just talking about students, guessing what grade they might get, although that can sometimes be a small part of it.
Right.
We're really focusing on how students themselves view this tool for learning when they find it genuinely helpful, when they maybe don't quite see the point, and crucially, what makes it effective in the first place.
Okay, so getting the student perspective.
Hmm.
And to get a real handle on this, we've got a fantastic resource as our foundation: a comprehensive review published in the Educational Psychology Review just last year, August 2023.
Mm.
The researchers, Yan, Panadero, Wang, and Zahn, they analyzed a massive 44 different studies to understand exactly how students perceive self-assessment.
44 studies, wow.
Yeah. Their main focus: two key areas: how useful students believe self-assessment is, and what factors influence whether they actually engage with it.
And that's our mission for you in this deep dive. We want to extract the most valuable insights from this extensive review. By the end of our conversation, you'll hopefully have a clear picture of how students view self-assessment,
Yeah.
what the key ingredients are for making it a valuable learning experience, and ultimately why this all matters for improving education.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The first big question the review tackles is, what's the general feeling among students about how useful self-assessment actually is? It sounds like the overall sentiment leans towards the positive, doesn't it?
That's the general direction the research points, yeah. A
Yeah.
majority of the studies they examined found that students tend to see self-assessment as a valuable tool. They reported benefits like becoming more independent learners, taking greater ownership of their learning journey, and even developing more confidence in their abilities.
That makes sense. It puts the student in a more active role, which can be really empowering, can't it?
Exactly.
The review also highlighted that students feel self-assessment helps them approach their work in a more structured way
Right.
and encourages them to think more analytically and critically about their own understanding. Several studies apparently highlighted this positive perspective.
Yeah, studies by folks like Bork, CO, and Van Helvoort indicated that students appreciate how self-assessment helps them structure their learning and become sort of more analytical about their own work.
And what's fascinating here, something you pointed out earlier, is that students don't just see it as a way to maybe improve their grades.
No, some actually recognize its value for their future careers, which is a really insightful perspective on their part.
Absolutely. But like with anything in education, that overall positive view isn't the full story, is it? There are definitely some shades of gray here.
Precisely. The review points out that some students have reservations about how useful self-assessment is, especially if they don't receive any feedback from external sources, like their teacher or instructor.
Right, that external validation piece. The review gave some specific examples of this. For instance, medical postgraduates and trainees didn't find self-assessment very helpful unless they got immediate feedback from their trainers.
Which is understandable in medicine, right? You need that expert check.
Totally. In a field where precision and expertise are critical, knowing if you're on the right track in real time is probably essential.
And it wasn't just limited to medical professionals. Other students questioned their progress without teacher feedback because they weren't confident in the accuracy of their own self-evaluation.
They doubted themselves.
Yeah. And similarly, some medical students felt that self-assessment didn't really boost their learning or their motivation.
That's where that really telling quote came in, was that one of the students described self-assessment as just a matter of formality, something they just went through the motions of, but didn't really see any genuine benefit in. That really speaks volumes about their experience.
It does.
This suggests that if students don't understand the purpose or see a direct link to their learning, self-assessment just becomes well, a box-ticking exercise rather than a real opportunity for growth.
It does indeed. It underscores the idea that self-assessment on its own might not be sufficient for all learners or, in every learning context. The perceived value really seems to depend on a combination of factors.
And it's interesting how different students' perceptions can be. The review mentioned a study where some students found self-assessment really effective for learning and improvement, while others viewed it more as a way to manage their teacher's impression of them. That's a pretty strategic and maybe a little cynical way of looking at it.
It highlights that students are often very aware of the assessment context and how their own evaluations might be interpreted by others. It's not always purely about internal reflection for personal learning.
Right, there's an audience. Then there was another study mentioned, Hanrahan and Isaacs. Some students felt their work was already the best they could produce.
Right. I've done my best. What more is there to assess?
Yeah, so self-assessment didn't seem to offer much additional value. But then on the other hand, others found that it really pushed them to engage in more critical thinking about their work.
That contrast perfectly illustrates the individual nature of how self-assessment is received. What one student finds empowering and insightful, another might perceive as unnecessary or even, maybe, intimidating.
So it's definitely not a simple case of students universally embracing or rejecting self-assessment. Much more complex. This leads us to the next logical question. What are the specific factors that actually influence whether students perceive self-assessment as useful or not? The review neatly categorizes these into individual and instructional factors. Let's start by looking at those individual factors.
Right. So when we talk about individual factors, the review considered things like gender, age, and educational level. Interestingly, they didn't find any significant difference in how useful students perceived self-assessment to be based on their gender.
Oh, okay. So boys and girls felt pretty similarly.
Yeah, a couple of studies cited indicated similar attitudes towards self-assessment between boys and girls in various grade levels.
That's interesting to note. It suggests the perceived value isn't really tied to gender, at least based on the research they analyzed.
Right.
What about age and educational level? That feels like it might have a more noticeable impact.
It does seem to. The review found that older students, like those in grades 10 through 12, and students in higher education, particularly, say, fourth-year students,
Right.
they tend to view self-assessment as more beneficial.
That kind of aligns with what we might expect, doesn't it? Older students likely have more experience with different assessment methods and maybe a more developed understanding of their own learning processes and goals.
Exactly. The review contrasted this with younger primary school students who often find assessments led by their teachers more helpful for understanding what they have learned.
They rely more on the teacher's view.
Hmm. They also pointed out that secondary students tend to have a more sophisticated understanding of how self-assessment relates to their overall learning objectives.
So as students mature and become more aware of their own learning journey, self-assessment seems to resonate more strongly with them. Okay, now let's shift our focus to instructional factors, the elements that educators can actually influence within the classroom or learning environment. What were the key instructional factors that seem to influence the perceived usefulness of self-assessment?
Well, the most significant one, which we touched on earlier, is external feedback.
Right, that came up multiple
Yeah.
times.
Yeah, the review strongly establishes a link between receiving external feedback and how valuable students perceive self-assessment to be. Students highly value feedback from their teachers because it helps them, understand the expectations of learning tasks more clearly
Well,
and identify specific areas where they need to focus their improvement efforts.
and timeliness seems key too. The review mentioned a study emphasizing how much students appreciate timely feedback.
Absolutely. It's not just about getting feedback at some point, but getting it when you can actually use it effectively in the learning process.
Right, well, it's still relevant.
Yeah. And going back to the medical students we discussed earlier, their perspective was that the lack of feedback from their supervisors was a significant barrier to making meaningful self-assessments about their clinical skills.
Okay.
The review even highlighted that poor quality feedback from peers can actually negatively impact how useful students perceive self-assessment to be. So it's not just about receiving any feedback, the quality of that feedback is crucial.
That's a really important takeaway. The quality and the timeliness of external feedback appear essential for students to recognize the value in evaluating their own work. What other instructional factors play a role?
The way self-assessment is structured, particularly the use of specific instruments like rubrics and checklists, also has a significant impact.
Okay, the tools themselves.
Yeah. The review found that when students have these tools to guide their self-assessment, they generally find the process more useful.
Rubrics were specifically mentioned as being particularly beneficial, weren't they?
Yes, indeed. Students see rubrics as a very valuable reference point that makes self-assessment more meaningful. They can help students pinpoint specific errors in their work and clearly understand the criteria for successful performance.
Like having a roadmap.
Exactly. One study cited detailed how rubrics support all three stages of self-regulated learning: planning, monitoring their performance during the task, and reflecting on their learning afterwards. Think about trying to build with Legos without instructions. It's much harder to know if you're doing it right.
That's a great analogy.
Rubrics are like the instructions for learning. They show students what a good finished product looks like.
So if a student clearly understands what they're aiming for
Yeah.
and can use a rubric to assess how their work aligns with those goals, it makes the self-assessment process much more tangible and, well, less subjective.
Exactly. And that study also identified 5 key factors that influence how effective rubrics are, how comprehensively they cover the task, and how well they're structured.
Okay.
The clarity of the descriptions for different performance levels, the range of scores available, the student's existing knowledge of the subject matter, and even how long the self-assessment activity lasts. All these details can make a difference.
So it's not just about providing a rubric. It needs to be thoughtfully designed and implemented effectively.
Yeah.
Interesting. The review also mentioned that medical trainees actually preferred broader global rating scales over simple checklists sometimes.
Right. That's an interesting nuance. It suggests that in some fields, maybe a more holistic overall evaluation might be seen as more useful than just ticking off whether specific tasks were completed.
Okay, so external feedback and the use of well-designed instruments are key instructional factors. What was the third significant one?
The intended purpose of the self-assessment itself.
Ah, why are we doing this?
Exactly. The review found that when self-assessment is clearly designed to promote learning and improvement, what we often call formative assessment,
Right.
students generally view it more favorably than when it's used for summative purposes, where grades are directly assigned.
That makes intuitive sense. If a grade is attached, the focus might shift from genuine self-reflection and finding growth areas to simply trying to get the best mark. Less about learning, more about the score.
Precisely. The review mentioned an example where students valued having dedicated time to reflect on their work more than the actual mark they might give themselves. And interestingly, in some instances, students actually preferred more open-ended, qualitative self-assessment approaches over more structured, quantitative ones based on rubrics.
That is a bit surprising. You might think the structured approach of a rubric would be consistently seen as more helpful, maybe easier.
It could be that the open-ended format allows for more personalized and, nuanced reflection, giving students the opportunity to articulate their understanding in their own words, rather than being constrained by predefined categories in a rubric.
Allows for more individual voice, perhaps.
Okay.
Okay. So to summarize the usefulness aspect, while there's a general positive feeling towards self-assessment, it's significantly influenced by the learner's age and educational stage.
Mm-hmm.
And crucially, by instructional factors like timely and high-quality external feedback, using well-designed tools like rubrics, and a clear focus on using self-assessment for learning and development rather than solely for grading.
Exactly. Now, the second major area that the review explored is the factors that influence whether students actually implement self-assessment, whether they actively, engage in the process.
Okay, so moving from thinking it's useful to actually doing it.
Yeah.
Again, the review looked at both individual and instructional factors here. Let's start with the individual drivers of implementation.
The most significant individual factor, perhaps not surprisingly, is how useful students perceive self-assessment to be.
Okay, so perception drives action.
Pretty much. If students believe that self-assessment is a valuable tool for their learning, for understanding their strengths and weaknesses, tracking progress, building confidence, they are much more likely to actually engage in it.
So it's a bit of a positive cycle, isn't it? If they think it's useful, they're more likely to participate. And if they participate effectively, maybe they're more likely to see its usefulness.
That seems logical. The review mentioned this applies across different subjects like math and writing, and even extends to how they view its relevance for their future career paths.
Right. Another key individual factor mentioned was their affective attitude, basically, whether they actually enjoy doing self-assessment or not.
Yeah, their feelings about it. While this can evolve over time and be shaped by their experiences, if they have a generally positive feeling towards it, they are more inclined to implement it.
But it can change, right? The review cited a study looking at self-assessment diaries, where initial enthusiasm sometimes decreased over time.
That's right. It reminds us that keeping students engaged with self-assessment can be an ongoing challenge.
True. The review also noted that if students feel their work is valued and appreciated, they are more likely to participate in self-assessment activities.
That highlights the importance of the overall learning environment and how students perceive the evaluation of their work, even when it's self-evaluation.
Okay. And then there's self-efficacy.
Right, self-efficacy. That's essentially how confident someone is in their ability to succeed in a specific task, in this case, self-assessment. If students believe they can effectively self-assess, they are more likely to actually do it.
That makes perfect sense. If you don't believe you're good at something, you're probably less motivated to put in the effort.
Exactly. A study referenced linked self-efficacy to behaviors like actively seeking feedback and engaging in self-reflection. However, and this is important, it also pointed out a potential pitfall. Overconfidence can sometimes lead to overestimation in self-assessment.
Ah, so being confident doesn't mean being accurate.
That's a crucial point to keep in mind. Having high confidence in your self-assessment abilities doesn't automatically mean your self-evaluations will be accurate. There's a balance needed.
Got it. The review also mentioned that a student's general academic confidence can even influence how they evaluate themselves on tasks not directly related to academics.
Yeah, that was an interesting finding. Feeling generally good about yourself academically can even sort of skew your self-perceptions in other areas.
Hmm, okay. What other individual factors drive the implementation of self-assessment?
The beliefs and attitudes of important others, like teachers and peers, really matter.
Social influence.
Yeah, often referred to as subjective norms. If students perceive that their teachers and classmates think self-assessment is a valuable activity, they're more likely to engage in it themselves.
Makes sense. The review mentioned how conflicting expectations between what students believe and what their teachers expect can create confusion and maybe negatively impact their willingness to implement self-assessment.
Right, and it also raises the point that some students might engage in self-assessment primarily to please their teachers or parents rather than for their own learning and growth.
Doing it for the wrong reasons, etc.
Which leads us to the final individual factor, psychological safety.
Feeling safe, to be honest.
Exactly. Feeling secure and supported within the learning environment is essential for students to participate openly and honestly in self-assessment, especially when it involves maybe sharing their evaluations with others.
Yeah, the review highlighted concerns students might have about potential bias, negative reactions from teachers, or even just the general stress associated with being evaluated, even if it's self-evaluation.
But importantly, they also found a positive correlation between feeling safe in the learning environment and actually taking action to implement self-assessment strategies.
So safety encourages participation.
Precisely. If students feel that their self-assessment efforts will be valued and won't lead to negative consequences, they are much more likely to participate fully and honestly.
Okay, so the key individual factors influencing doing self-assessment are perceived usefulness, positive attitude, self-efficacy, confidence, influence of others, and psychological safety. Now, let's move to the instructional side. What can educators do to encourage students to actively engage?
Well, providing ample opportunities for practice and explicit training in how to self-assess are fundamental.
Teaching them how.
Exactly. The review consistently found that when students receive clear instruction on the process of self-assessment and have regular opportunities to practice, they become more confident and more willing to engage in it.
That makes perfect sense. You can't really expect students to be proficient at something they haven't been taught or given a chance to practice.
No, absolutely not. Several studies demonstrated the positive impact of practice on students' attitudes towards self-assessment. And it was also noted that students' intention to use self-assessment in the future increases after they have actually completed a self-assessment task.
Who doing it makes you more likely to do it again.
It's all about building familiarity and developing competence. Like any skill, the ability to self-assess effectively improves with practice.
Okay. And feedback comes up again here too, right?
Yes, back to external feedback. It not only influences how useful students perceive self-assessment to be, but also significantly impacts their willingness to implement it. The review found that feedback from both teachers and peers is crucial for students to complete self-assessments thoroughly and, importantly, to do so accurately.
Right, calibration. The review highlighted the benefits of peer feedback, the increased accuracy often associated with teacher feedback, and even the finding that high-achieving students tend to value feedback from tutors particularly highly. The usefulness of seeing concrete examples and receiving feedback electronically were also noted as helpful.
Yeah, all these forms of external feedback provide valuable benchmarks and help students to calibrate their own judgments against external standards. Make sense?
And the tools again. Rubrics, checklists.
Yes, the use of instruments like guidelines, checklists, and rubrics also plays a crucial role here. These tools not only make self-assessment seem more useful, as we discussed, but they also provide a clear framework that facilitates the process
Makes it easier to do
and encourages students to actually engage in it.
because they provide a clear structure and make the process more manageable. The review reiterated how rubrics can help with goal setting, quality checks, promoting reflection, ultimately contributing to developing self-monitoring habits.
Right, and they even highlighted a gender-related finding, where girls indicated a stronger intention to use rubrics during evaluation in one study.
Interesting. Okay, finally, what about the environment?
The overall environmental support within the learning context plays a significant role. This includes elements like maybe providing incentives for engaging in self-assessment,
Like points or recognition.
potentially. Also, the impact of a healthy sense of competition in some cases, and the availability of emotional support from peers. A learning environment that explicitly values and encourages self-assessment makes students more likely to participate actively.
So culture matters. The review cited findings about positive effects of incentives, the influence of competition, and the value of peer support. They also noted that a lack of perceived support can significantly dampen students' motivation to engage.
Absolutely. Ultimately, it kind of boils down to creating a learning environment where students feel well prepared, adequately supported, and genuinely motivated to actively reflect on and evaluate their own learning.
Okay, so if we really distill it down for our listener, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive? It seems clear students have a pretty wide range of opinions on just how useful self-assessment is.
That's absolutely right. While many students recognize the benefits fostering independence, responsibility, critical thinking, this positive view isn't universal, especially if it's not accompanied by meaningful and timely external feedback.
Yeah, that feedback piece is huge. And there's a whole host of individual factors like their age, their confidence in their own abilities to self-assess, and how they perceive the value that teachers and peers place on it
Hmm?
that significantly influence whether they see it as a valuable tool and whether they're actually willing to engage in it.
And from an instructional perspective, it's clear that educators have many levers they can pull, providing clear guidelines and well-designed rubrics, offering timely and high-quality feedback, ensuring students get adequate practice and training,
Right.
and cultivating a supportive and psychologically safe learning environment are all crucial for maximizing the potential benefits.
It really underscores the fact that simply, throwing self-assessment activities out there isn't enough.
Not at all.
You have to actively consider the student's perspectives and design these activities thoughtfully and strategically.
Precisely. Understanding how students themselves view this process is absolutely fundamental if we want to make self-assessment a truly effective tool for enhancing their learning and development.
This deep dive into students' perceptions really gives us a lot to consider. Thinking about all these student perspectives, what do you see as maybe the most critical shifts educators could make in their self-assessment practices to truly unlock its potential for learning?
That's a really thought-provoking question.
It really prompts you to reflect on your own learning experiences, doesn't it? The times when self-assessment has either been really helpful or maybe fallen a bit short.
It does, and it pushes us to think beyond the theory and consider the practical implications. This review definitely provides us with a solid foundation for maybe exploring specific self-assessment techniques and how they can be most effectively applied in different educational contexts down the road.